Hey everybody. Uh how are you doing? Doing sort of a late night stream here. It's another majestic INFJ. Today I'm just gonna riff on really just sort of typology in general. This is kind of a video I was wanting to do anyways. And in a way it sort of got prompted by a comment um somebody left on another video, which is pretty much what I expected was going to happen when I started posting videos. And that's pretty much what anybody who starts posting videos, especially if they say they're like an INTJ or an INFJ, you're going to get a whole slew of comments with people sort of chiming in and telling you that you're wrong and you're not this, you're that, or whatever. Um, I've been doing this for 20 years. People were doing it 10, 20 years ago. People are doing it now. They're going to do it 10 years from now and 20 years from now. It's just not going to stop because it's inherently the nature of this kind of subject matter and, typology in general, because which we'll get into as I sort of riff it on it. Um, it's not really, I mean, it's obviously not a hard science by any stretch of the imagination. It's open to a lot of interpretation, and you get a lot of people who are sort of, let's just say, low on starting off on the learning curve. And anybody who studies expertise and learning and knowledge and all that, there's this general phenomenon that when people start learning something and starting to get a grasp of it, then all of a sudden they become the world's expert, and want to, because they sort of frame it in their own mental framework and want to tell everybody how wrong they are. But like I said, it's to be expected. It's fine. Because I'm sure when I first started, I was doing the exact same thing. So cheers to you. That being said, you know, um, I do think it's sort of a waste of everybody's time and energy to do that, to sort of poke around videos and try to call people out for not being what they claim to be. At least not in any sort of helpful fashion. But I do welcome, if somebody's got something to say, or if they have some sort of insight that I don't have and they're willing to share, I'm happy to listen, and especially if you want to make a video and lay out your argument, I'm happy to respond in good faith. And for all I know, yeah, I mean, maybe I could be wrong. I'm willing to listen. Um, but you're obviously gonna have to back it up with some sort of, claim or framework that people could agree with. So that's just sort of a general thought. I mean, I was gonna sort of put that out there anyways, because I've been doing this long enough that I see it sort of all the time, and it's to be expected. But like I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've picked up a couple of psychology degrees along the way from pretty good psychology department at a very big psych university. So I'm pretty confident. Um, but that being said, I'm always willing to learn. And I'll also point out, and I'm going to get into this too, is that you know the typology community and the typology just subject in general, there's no consensus whatsoever, right? So if if you're sort of taking the position that you're right and everybody's wrong, um, you're probably going to want to sort of step back and reassess that, because even textbook psychology stuff, just learning and memory, language development, every single aspect or facet of psychology, there's competing theories that have been competing for years and decades, and I was part of academia for a long time. and I saw literal wars break out. Well, not literal wars, but very intense academic wars break out, over simple concepts like, what is episodic memory? Or what part of the brain is, controlling episodic memory versus, procedural memory or semantic memory, that kind of stuff. Um, so, the same for language development. I mean, there's been debates for years about how people acquire language, how people require visual representations of things. And, they're just theories. They're just sort of frameworks that people put out there. And sometimes the data agrees with them, sometimes it doesn't. And that's just psychology. That's psychology, that's economics, that's everything. And so it really opens up the question of, okay, well, what's the point of typology? I mean, why even bother, right? If we can't all agree that there's some sort of a, objective system out there that, all we need to do is just think about it really hard and everybody agree on terminology and we'll figure all this out. We're nowhere close to that. Maybe it's out there. Who knows? I think people are too complicated and too dynamic to really sort of settle on any sort of specific function or specific mapping, but maybe they do. Um, but so then why even bother, right? I mean, if there's no objective framework that everybody agrees on, and you either know it or you don't, then what's the point? And there was a guy who had a channel. They sort of got into this years ago, and I don't think he's posted anything recently. And if he has, it's on another channel. And if you know about him, let me know because I'd like to find whatever he's doing these days. But what was his channel? It was NF Geeks. I'm sure if you're into the typology stuff, I'm sure you've come across them. And some people agreed with them, some people didn't. That's fine. That's how all these channels go. But he was pretty insightful. I like the guy. And we actually interacted a few times while he had his channel going. And one of his, you know, last videos, I don't know if it was exactly the last video, but it was close to it. One of his videos, he started discussing, like, what is typology? What are we doing here when you sort of quote unquote get into typology and start learning about all this stuff. And he made a really good point that, sorry about the light that keeps shining out. I'm going to try to block it out. But anyways, uh, he made a really good point that really, all of this is just discourse. I think that's the word he used, is discourse or deliberation, where, we're just throwing ideas out there. We're just discussing ideas, and not in any sort of, loosey goosey postmodern kind of way where there really is no meaning to anything and we can ascribe any meaning we want to something. I mean, yeah, there is some structure, there is some general sketches, some general outlines, but by and large, we're really just talking about, descriptions of people and certain aspects of people and their psychology. And everything that we're doing is in the verbal realm, right? I'll sometimes try to make analogies to brain systems and what I think different brain systems are doing, because that was my background. Before I sort of switched careers, I was in cognitive neuroscience, and that's what we looked at, what different parts of the brain do different functions. And they map out pretty well to the Jungian cognitive functions. And so that's one of the reasons I tend to buy into it. But going back to this discourse point, discourse is just discussing and, trying to come up with a sort of verbal description of the physical world. And, you know, whenever you're in the verbal realm, there's no clear boundaries, right? Because we can always interpret words differently, right? I mean, even if we agree on the wording of how to describe something, we might disagree on each of those words, right? What does intuition really mean? What does dominant really mean? Um, all that kind of stuff. And so we're really just sort of engaging in this discourse. And when you have that kind of learning or sort of community contribution to learning at large, um you have to accept that different people are going to have different views of things and they're going to describe things differently. And like I said, I would see this happen in academia all the time, where two people would be arguing about what they thought different brain systems were doing. And I think if you really sat them down and you had God come down and say, you know, what exactly that part of the brain was doing, they both would say, well, that's what I've been saying all along, right? I think they were both sort of saying the same thing in a lot of ways, but just with some nuanced distinctions between the two. Um, but any sort of outside observer that wasn't knee deep or neck deep in their particular labs or research wouldn't see a difference, right? So when you're engaging in things like typology, you're engaging in discourse, and you're engaging in conversations about what you think is going on, like your observations about the world, your observations about people. And the best that you can do is come up with some sort of mental map that works for you. And and some people, some people have a really good map of it, and other people, I think, have some challenges. And so even starting with Young, I mean, so he came up with the whole idea of cognitive functions controlling the different types, and the thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition, and all that. But even his model was super super loose, and it was really just sort of a sort of a field guide almost for psychoanalysts at the time, to basically say, look, if you come across this type of person, this is probably the type of psychosis that they're gonna have. He wasn't really trying to map out with any specificity how all this works, like all the mechanics, and what what really is introverted intuition, and what types of people really do have introverted intuition. It wasn't schematic or mathematical or anything like that. It really was just sort of like a field guide for fellow practitioners, and psychoanalysts. And they were just sort of rough sketches, right? But because he's young, and he was a prolific writer, and really very insightful, a lot of people latched onto it and took off with it, right? And so then you get Myers-Briggs, who tried to make it a little bit more formulaic. And of course, this was sort of the period, forget when exactly they got real popular, but yeah, it was during the logical positivism type period, where people wanted specific mechanics, specific charts. What category do people fall into? The army was doing the IQ test, psychometrics, right? They wanted to be able to measure with some level of accuracy what's going on in the mind. And this was their way of contributing what we would call psychometrics to personality, and providing an actual test that, for better or worse, was probably pretty reliable, and probably somewhat valid for what they were testing. And they, were trying to come up with a very formulaic psychometric type of test where you could break people into very discrete categories. You're either this or you're that. But even there, if you read their book, I forget, differing gifts, something like that. Their big book where they outline the whole model. Um, even there, they're sort of loosey goosey with it, right? I mean, they understand that, this is not cut and dry, as cut and dried as, the psychometrics, the Skinner, sort of the Skinner psychologist that just wanted to break everything into mathematical equations. They realized that that really wasn't going to happen. So they talked about things as being preferences, and you could be sort of an S and sort of an N, just sort of based off of your preference. And, and it really is the difference of scoring, sort of a 51 versus a 49 on the test, that, puts you either in the S category or the N category. And then the Kiersey, I always forget this guy's name, but the guy who came up with the temperament model, the SPs, the SJs, the NTs, and the NFs. He did more of a sort of lumping together. He was like, look, in general, there's some sort of crossover, but if you're an NT, you tend to act like this. If you're an SP, you tend to act like that. And sort of acknowledging that not everything was as cut and dried as maybe, people wanted it to be, even though he still had his categories and he still broke everything down into, specific categories and subcategories. At the end of the day, he sort of looked at everything sort of in 4 quadrants, and you're in one of those. And then we, sort of move on. Academia started adopting the Oceans model, or the Big Five, which, has a lot of similarities to the cognitive functions, except they add neuroticism to them. But the other 4 in the Oceans model map on to, what we tend to think of cognitive functions as, in the Jungian typology world. But again, they sort of realized that it's not as cut and dried, and people are a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And it's more of how much of this and how much of that are you. And they developed some pretty fancy statistical models to sort of put people in more of an analog range, right? So instead of being, you're either a 1 or a 0, you're sort of in between 1 and 0, and somewhere on the spectrum, so to speak, on each of the different personality types or components. So so even academia has sort of gotten to the point where they realize, look, this isn't very rigid. It's very hard to measure this stuff, and so maybe it's just we're not very good at measuring it. And some real bright person's going to come along and find the way. And I've seen them all. I've seen everybody looking at little micro movements in the face, and coming up with their own online tests and stuff like that. And that's great. I think it advances knowledge. I mean, either it works or it doesn't, but I think anything that sort of advances the discourse on it, I think is a good thing. And you, as an individual member of the community sort of looking into this stuff, you can decide, what model is going to work for me. And again, this isn't like I'm not trying to be postmodern here and try to say that there is no objective reality and everybody is right and everybody has their own truth. I don't believe that at all. But I do believe that, when you're talking about a verbal field or a verbal system, a system based off of descriptions of people and their behaviors, it's not going to be cut and dried, no matter how hard you try. And it's sort of like the Gödel theorem in math, where there's always going to be inconsistency in any sort of formal system. And so there's going to be inconsistencies, there's going to be differences of opinion. It's not like physical reality where you can build a fence and that's where the fence is. For hundreds of years, the fence is going to be there and you're either on one side of the fence or the other side of the fence. Here, there's the line drawing is a little fuzzy, right? So that being said, somebody could be completely off, but um, so you have to sort of figure out where you are comfortable on the spectrum of, either there's an absolute objective reality and everybody else, I'm the only person in the world that understands it and everybody else is wrong. Chances are that's not the case, right? Or there is no such thing as personality and we're all just making this shit up. And we're just finding patterns in noise and making a big deal of it. And of course there's people who will argue that. I don't think it's on either end of the spectrum. I don't think we're just finding pattern in noise. I don't think that everybody fundamentally acts the same or has the same personality, but we're just sort of picking up on certain behaviors and people and trying to make patterns out of noise. I do think there are different personalities, and but I'm also not on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where I think that there's some hard and fast truth out there, and we just need to figure out where the lines are to be drawn. I mean, even particle physics doesn't get that specific about defining things, and there's a lot of disagreement there too. So the point being is, I do think there's room for disagreement. I do think there's room for discourse. And if anything that I say on this channel doesn't resonate or just seems to be factually incorrect for one reason or another, I'm happy to hear you out. Feel free to make a response video and I will do my best to respond to it in good faith. And I have no problem being challenged or learning from others if they've got something to offer. However, I don't think it's very productive to just, and again, this happens on every channel and I see it all the time. And it's probably you INTJs out there, or maybe ISTJs who think they're INTJs. There's a lot of those. Just sort of going from site to site. You're not a INFJ. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, let me know. I mean, I've lived with myself for over 40 years. I have a pretty good understanding of who I am. But if you've got a better model and a better way of picking out, who's who and what's what, let me know. I'd be happy to hear about it. It might be eye-opening. So that being said, what is the point, right? So, enough of this sort of academic kind of pondering on typology and what it, sort of in the abstract, what it is. Really, it boils down to, does it become useful for you? I mean, yes, it's fun to obsess over whether Keanu Reeves is an ISFJ or an INFJ or an ESFP or whatever. I'm just picking random things. That's fun. I get it. You can have little discussions and it sharpens your blades. And sometimes you'll have, somebody might argue with you and give you some insight that you never really thought about. And maybe you'll do the same for somebody else. And I get it. And that's totally cool, totally fun to obsess over. But I think the real benefit of, and this is just taking it from somebody who's been doing this for a really long time, or just, studying it, being into it, as much as I can. Um, the real benefit is, how can it help you in your life, right? Um, and if you can come up with a pretty good predictable model, or a model of the world, a model of personality that has some predictive value, right? Um, I could tell you, as somebody who has to deal with lots of different types of people all the time, every day, and often these people are pretty stressed out, because they got some sort of issue that they're coming to me for. um, you know, it really does help to have a general sense of personality and how these different things sketch out. I don't think anybody is ever really going to become some sort of Svengali or, you know, um, mind reader to where, you can see somebody for 5 seconds and immediately know whether they're an ISFJ or an INFJ or something like that. I think it takes time to figure somebody out. However, there are some pretty good shortcuts. You can narrow down the field pretty quickly, especially using that sort of temperament model. Are they an NT? Are they likely an NF? Are they likely an SP? Are they likely an ST? That does a pretty good job of, sort of uh, a quick way of sort of figuring out who you're dealing with, and what they care about. Because when you're interacting with people, at any sort of job or school or family life or whatever, it really, really does help knowing in general what type of person this is. And yeah, you might not know if they're an ESFJ versus an ESTJ or whatever. But if you get a general sense, like, this is the type of person I'm dealing with, and this is the type of person that these are the types of things they care about. Here's the type of response that they're looking for. Here's stuff that they don't find relevant. Here's a way of explaining, a pretty complicated topic to them. Um, it helps. It really does. Because, if I'm dealing with an NT client, who really wants to get to the bottom of how something works and how it's going to play out, then I will take the extra time to explain to them and maybe write a longer email or give them more references or things, background information that they can look into, that kind of thing, just because I know they're an NT and they want to figure it out. As opposed to somebody who might be an SP, and an SP just wants the answer. They just want the answer and they want to move on a lot of times. And they don't really care so much about the explanation, the little nuances of why the tax code says this as opposed to that. They just want their lawyer or whoever to tell them that, it's okay to do what they want to do. And then they're going to go on and do what they want to do, and then go play golf or, whatever they do, whatever the SPs are out doing these days. Um, and and so it really does help interacting with people, because it allows you to sort of change the way that you approach different people, and showing that you understand them, you understand where they're coming from, and you understand what they want, right? Because probably the biggest problem that or maybe not the biggest problem, but a big problem that I see with especially a lot of new lawyers and even some old lawyers that are just sort of stuck in their ways, is that they just sort of had this assumption that everybody is the same and everybody wants the same type of answer, right? And so if the lawyer happens to be an NT, they sort of see the world through this NT lens, and they just sort of figure, well, if somebody was giving me a response, here's the type of response I'd want, a 10-page memo with footnotes and citations and an explanation of all the different nuances and exceptions to exceptions and things like that. Very, very detailed, very, very systematic, that you'd expect an NT to produce. And then again, in sharp contrast, an SP type lawyer, they'll send you a 1 or 2 word response in an email, like "okay" or "thanks, call me" or whatever, and you're just like, what am I supposed to do with this? So point being that, a lot of people get into this rut just sort of thinking that the world everybody else in the world is like them, and they're going to want a response or an answer or whatever that sort of matches up with what they themselves personally would want. And of course that's not true, right? And this also helped. I mean, even when I was in law school, and your first year they sort of throw you into classes that are sort of mandatory, and so everybody has to take the same classes, and a lot of times they'll try to spice it up by having different types of professors for different types of classes. So you might have one professor who's hard left socialist, very, very labor rights, sees the Constitution a certain way, sees property law a certain way, contract law a certain way, from a very maybe Marxist or socialist lens. And then on the exact opposite, you might have another professor for another class who's just a hardline, conservative, free market, libertarian, government can't touch me, or, kind of professor. And I think they sort of do that so that you have a, quote unquote, diverse learning experience, or, seeing the law from different angles. And I do think there's some benefit to it. I'm definitely not complaining about it. But the thing is most law students go in there, they know nothing about personality types and the different types of personalities out there. They might go in there just sort of thinking a law professor is a law professor, right? And every law professor is just sort of the same. And they all are going to want sort of the same type of response or the same type of answer on a test, because the law is the law. It's a lot of people saw it as like it's math or something, and you're just sort of regurgitating formulas. And it's not like that at all. A lot of the law is personality dependent, or at least sort of the work that you do as a lawyer. So, if you're dealing with a professor who's sort of a hard left socialist, and they give you a test question, they're going to be looking for different types of answers than their counterpart, who might be more of a right-wing, free market, libertarian, laissez-faire type of professor. And yes, I know they're not all right-wing. I get it, but bear with me. But anyways, and so when you're writing out responses for different professors, it helps to know the personality type of that professor, right? So the one I'm thinking of that was more sort of left-leaning, well, he was very left-leaning. He was an NF. He was an NF through and through. I don't know if he was an ENFJ, INFJ, whatever, but he was definitely an NF, right? I mean, he was very, very values focused, probably an ENFP, actually, if I had to think about it. Where, my more conservative guy, he was probably more of a ESTJ, maybe an INTJ. He might have been an NT. but more likely an SJ, you know, worked in the Nixon administration, like very, very old school. But he was hilarious. He was a really funny guy. I really liked him. I like both of them actually. And so that's what personality, studying personality does for you is you just pick up on this stuff, like not even thinking about it. Like you don't have to figure out like, oh, this guy's an ENFP definitely through and through. You just get a sense, right? Because you just see the different personality types interacting in the community and you get a sense of what they care about and what sets them off and what makes them happy, and you can use that to your advantage. I've been out of law school for a long time now, going on I guess 15 years at this point, and I use it every day. I really do. I when I'm interacting with clients, I'm interacting with different lawyers, and I'm different lawyers at my firm. I just get the general sense of who they are, what they care about, how they think about different things. And it's a lot easier to give them a response that sort of fits their personality style. And I mean, if you held a gun to my head and you asked, okay, what's the specific personality of each of these people? Like, how are they going to test on an MBTI test or something? I don't know. I really don't. But I have a sense, right? And I have rough sketches. I can tell you what they probably aren't, right? But narrowing it down to the actual specific type, who knows? I obviously have my guesses, and sometimes I could be surprised to be wrong because sometimes some of these guys that I interact with, they're into personality stuff too, or they might have taken a test, just out of curiosity, and then they'll tell me what they got. And I'm like, really? So sometimes I really am just sort of surprised, but they'll be like, oh, okay, I can kind of see it. So I have a pretty good batting average, but there's definitely been some misses. Um, so the point of this channel, I think, is really, by and large, it's just me going to be riffing and what, somebody who's sort of done this for a while, just sort of letting my observations about things. But I claim no higher knowledge or expertise, other than just my own experience and, putting a reasonable amount of thought behind it. Um, and seeing all the arguments that have blown up over the course of the years of whether Keanu Reeves is FJ or an INFJ, that kind of thing. And I'm sure somebody's gonna have an argument for some other type. It's fine. It's how you see the world. As long as it works for you is the point. Yes, there should be some objectivity to it. Yes, it should be based in some form of reality. And it should have some sort of predictive value. But in the end, it's going to come down to your interpretation of things. And somebody who it's sort of like the philosophical question of, does everybody see red the same? Right. So we can all point to something and say that's red, but there's sort of this, question in psychology, consciousness research of whether or not the actual experience is the same for everybody, right? Because all we can do is point to something that's red, but and we all agree, okay, that whatever that color is, whatever that shade is red, but my red might be, if we switched eyeballs and brain circuitry and everything, I might see, through your eyeballs, I might see the color, what I call green, right? So my red is your green and your green is my red or something like that, right? Just on an experiential level, right? We still point to the same thing when we're pointing to a red thing. It's just our experience is different. And I think That's maybe a way to sort of think of typology is, we can all sort of agree on, what an INFJ is or what an ENFJ is or something. And we all have sort of a rough description and how we think it works. But my sort of vibe that I get, my sort of, this person gives me INFJ vibes, might be very different from somebody else, um, where they might get a different sort of vibe from them. Now, it's not the perfect analogy because we're not all pointing to the same people and saying and agreeing, yeah, that's an INFJ. But my point is that, there's some sort of experiential, personal vibe feeling that you get when you see different people, especially when you start out and you're sort of learning about all this stuff. You just get this like, that guy gives me the INFJ vibe. That guy gives me an ISTJ vibe. And you're going to carry that through for, forever. But it's going to sort of fine tune itself, I think, over the years, because the more you do this and the more people you meet and the more you sort of engage in discourse with other people, you'll sort of fine tune, that sort of intuitive vibe that you get. Um, so I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going with that. but I guess the point being that, you know, go with the flow, use all this as discourse, but don't get too, don't put your head up your ass too much on it. Nobody is going to walk away the world's leader on whether or not somebody is an INFJ or an ISTJ. Um, it's all going to come down to pretty much a vibe. I do think that there are some pretty good systematic ways of nailing it down or narrowing it down. And for those of you who might not be familiar, there's a website or channel out there talking with famous people with host Eric, who's a blast. I get it. He's very divisive among the community, and he's his own character. But I have to admit, he's very like his model. I think is uh, very spot on. And I think the way he describes it, or once you sort of watch a lot of his videos and you sort of pick up on, okay, here's how the model works. And, full disclosure, he did a testing session with me. Um, and the way that he does the testing is, pretty much trying to follow the scientific method where what he's doing is trying to falsify something, and that's essentially what you're trying to do at any sort of scientific test. So I'm happy to get into it in another video. I don't want to go down that path, but um, the point is that he focuses on zeroing in on what your polar function is, or your blind spot, your seven slot function. And when you do that, that way you can test people, and then if they just sort of flub up on the cognitive test that is testing their polar function, then okay, they've got to be one of two types, right? Because they're just they're this function is clearly a blind spot. Like they're trying to use a different function to answer the question, where everybody else where it's not a blind spot for them will answer the question in a certain way, right? Because they're using the appropriate function. But if you have a blind spot, then you'll sort of answer it in a different way using a different function. So you're trying to solve the problem, but not using the function that is sort of built for that kind of problem, right? So, for example, the example I always like to use is a TE question would be, you know, you're driving down the street, your tire pops, you have to change your tire, and you've never done it before. What do you do? How do you, how many steps is it going to take you to change the tire? And if you're somebody like me, I'm TE polar, my immediate response is like, well, I'm going to call somebody, who can either come out and help me change the tire or at least talk me through it and explain what I need to do. Because I could probably figure it out. If I devoted enough attention to it, I think I'd be able to figure out how to change a tire if I needed to. But my immediate attention, my immediate response to how do I deal with this problem is switch it to a social domain, switch it to an FE solution, and call somebody, have somebody help me, or try to convince somebody to come out and do it. Right. That I've now taken a TE task and I've shifted it over to an FE task. And so when you respond to different types of questions like that, where you try to answer the question by flipping it into another function or the domain of another function, that will sort of point out that might, you might be polar there. And so, for anybody who wants to sort of engage and, discuss the pros and cons of anything that I'm saying, or, go out there and try to type somebody, the one thing that I would ask is, approach it from that perspective, because I think that's really scientifically the only way, you can even get close to coming up with some sort of objective determination on somebody's personality, is to have that falsifiable claim, right? I was able to show or falsify that this person can't or is sort of deficient in some respects, in this particular function, right? And then I can sort of map out all the other functions and sort of, roughly figure out where they are, right? But the linchpin is finding out that polar function, right? So if you want to try to type Keanu Reeves, or if you want to try to type Joe Rogan, or any sort of celebrity, or me, or anybody else on the internet, you know, I'm not really going, I'm not going to believe you until you show me what function are they missing, or what function do they seem to have a blind spot for, or some sort of deficiency in. Because unless you can point that out and provide pretty solid evidence for it, um, all you're doing is confirmation bias, or, sort of affirming your confirmation bias by, going into it thinking like, oh, that guy's totally an ENFP, and, just look at him, look at all that extroverted intuition, look at all that introverted feeling. Of course he's an ENFP. That's just confirmation bias. That's not showing or demonstrating anything. That's just you sort of picking out evidence to support what you already believed in the first place, right? And then it's just a matter of, who screams the loudest. But on the flip side, if you can show me, okay, here's a function that you're clearly not using or avoiding using or whatever, and show me specific behavioral examples of, why, what I'm doing to make you feel that way, or what Joe Rogan does, or what Keanu Reeves does to make you think, okay, they're blind in that function, then I'll listen. We might disagree. Like, for example, I think Joe Rogan's an ESFP, and everybody thinks he's an ENTJ or something like that, which is nuts to me, but whatever. But the reason I think he's an ESFP is because, I think I think his introverted. I think he's polar on introverted thinking. Um, I'm happy to map out all the other functions that I think work for him. But I think introverted thinking is a polar function. And what I would point to is watch any episode where somebody tries to describe cryptocurrency to him or anything that's sort of mathematical or logic based. He just completely ignores it and moves on to something else or talks about it and using a different function. Um, I think he's got plenty of, strong TE. So I'm not trying to, say he doesn't have any sort of thinking function, but the TI seems to be his blind spot. But if you disagree, let me know. Wait, what do you think his blind spot is? Um, but don't start off that. I would ask you, don't start off the conversation by saying, well, he's clearly an ENTJ because he's got such strong introverted intuition and extroverted thinking, and then point to a bunch of different examples where he uses introverted intuition and extroverted thinking. Yes, he's going to use those at some point. He will use those functions. And so it does it so pointing to examples of when he uses it does nothing for anybody. But if you can point to where he sort of consistently and reliably sort of breaks down, then we're talking. Then we can start sort of narrowing things down. Hopefully that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, I'm happy to do another video sort of getting into more detail on that. Again, I'd invite you to watch Thinking with Famous People as long as you can put up with the eccentricity of the channel. It's hilarious. To me, it's hilarious. I'm a big fan, but I do understand that it's not for everybody. But I would argue that Eric's model and his systematic approach, systematic as it is the best we've got. I think it's better than the MBTI test. I think it's better than the Oceans test. As far as just sort of narrowing down what somebody's type likely is. And if it doesn't fit into all the other models out there, fine. He's got his own model. I happen to agree with it. It's great. If you got another model that you like, great. But you need to to convince somebody like me and a lot of other people, you need to show some sort of falsifiable claim or some sort of approach where you're falsifying some claim for it to be sort of scientifically valid in my view. Okay, I think that's probably about it. I might riff on this a little bit more. Again, I've got plenty to say about typology and sort of the meaning of it and the just functionally what it is, structurally what it is, substantively what it is, and then just practically, like, how can you use it in your own life, what it is. But overall, happy to engage in any sort of discourse, happy to join anybody's channel who wants to talk and tell me what's what. I'm happy to listen. But other than that, have a good day and talk to you later. Bye.